I've sometimes caught myself thinking that, for people long before our time, relentless icy rain might have been a far bigger threat than someone coming at them with a weapon. Back then, without central heating, man-made fabrics, or anything even close to a waterproof jacket, getting soaked for too long could easily kill a person through hypothermia. Out in the wild, staying dry wasn't about feeling comfortable. It was the one thing entire communities depended on just to stay alive. For generations, the indigenous nations across North America, from the thick eastern woodlands all the way out to the wide-open plains, became masters at facing down the weather. They figured out how to use whatever nature gave them in ways that feel almost unreal to us today, turning simple things like smoke and animal fat into a dependable kind of armor. Stick with me, because by the end of this you'll see how even a strip of leather could keep a warrior alive, and why the smoke from a campfire often mattered more than the flames themselves. And here's the part that always amazes me. The most effective raincoat they had was something you couldn't even see. Their first and strongest defense against endless dampness was their own skin, protected with a special coating. The Plains tribes knew all too well that wet clothing didn't just feel miserable, it pulled heat right out of the body. So when the rain came down hard and every stitch of cloth was guaranteed to get soaked, the smartest move was to strip down and protect the skin directly. They used a blend of bear or bison fat mixed with certain herbs, creating a thin, water-shedding film over the body. That layer of fat worked pretty much like the oil on a duck's feathers. The water slid right off instead of soaking in. It also trapped body warmth and kept the cold wind from cutting into the skin. Putting on this coating wasn't some rare thing either. It was part of daily life, especially in the fall when the cold rains could settle in for days. Every bit of skin needed to be covered, and folks paid special attention to their chest, shoulders, and feet. Even the face got a light layer, just enough to keep water from pooling in the eyes or chilling the cheeks. Sure, the stuff had a strong smell, but when you're trying to stay alive, scent isn't exactly the top priority. Hunters saved that fat carefully, storing it in bladders or rawhide containers. It was prized almost as much as weapons because without it, a person had no real defense against the cold and wet. Some tribes even mixed in pigments like red ochre, which made the coating even more effective. The ochre acted like a gentle abrasive and added another layer of protection, helping with insects and even harsh sunlight once the rain finally let up. It's interesting to see how different cultures around the world have their own take on this kind of survival knowledge. What do you think of all this? If this kind of story grabs your attention, stick around. There's always more to share. Now, here's something a lot of people don't realize. It wasn't just tanning skills, but the power of smoke itself that turned raw hides into material that could hold up against water. Untreated hide gets slimy and heavy when wet, and when it dries, it stiffens like a plank and can crack. But with the right smoking process, hides from deer or bison could be transformed into soft, breathable, water-resistant suede. It was a long, careful job that turned something basic and organic into dependable clothing. Native women put up small, tent-like structures made of stitched hides and hung fresh skins inside over slow-burning, rotting wood. The smoke seeped into the fibers, wrapping around them and changing them on a tiny, almost invisible level. Because of that, the fibers wouldn't cling together in the rain, and the leather stayed flexible no matter how soaked it got. Smoked hide turned a warm golden brown color and carried a distinct smell that folks pretty much lived with all their lives. The longer the hide stayed in the smoke, the darker and more moisture-resistant it became. For things that needed to be extra tough, moccasins, capes, or outer layers, they used a heavier smoking process that could darken the leather to a deep chocolate color. They picked specific kinds of wood that produced thick, steady smoke without creating too much heat. Rotten stumps and resin-rich woods were favorites. The fire had to stay low. If it flared up, the hide could burn or shrink, ruining days of hard work. Keeping it just right took patience and an attentive eye. The whole process could stretch on for several days, but the payoff was huge. A material that dried fast after rain and bounced right back to being soft without any extra treatment. Clothing made from smoked leather wasn't completely waterproof like modern rubber, but it breathed well and held up beautifully in harsh weather. That breathability was a big deal because if you sealed yourself inside something completely watertight, you'd start sweating like crazy, and that trapped moisture could chill you just as fast as rain pouring down from the sky. Smoked suede, though, had this clever way of swelling up when it got damp, tightening its structure so water stayed out while still letting the body breathe. It worked almost like an early version of a modern membrane, keeping both heat and humidity in balance. And even soaked, this kind of clothing held warmth far better than the woven fabrics the Europeans later introduced. Now, if you're ready for it, there's a tiny detail in native clothing that could shed an unbelievable amount of water, and most folks today assume it was added strictly for decoration. Those long fringes hanging off sleeves, shoulders, and seams weren't fashion statements. They were downright genius engineering. On a smooth leather shirt, rain tends to smear across the surface or run right down the sides, soaking into seams or pooling around the waist. But fringe breaks that up. Each strip acts like its own little drainage path, splitting the water into dozens of thin streams. As gravity pulls the water downward, it rides along those narrow leather strips until it finally gathers into droplets at the very tips. Once it reached the ends, the water simply dripped off before it had the chance to soak the rest of the clothing or seep down to the skin. Thanks to the fringe, the core parts of a jacket, leggings, or shirt stayed relatively dry far longer than they would have otherwise. This mattered especially at the seams. Every stitch made a small hole, a weak spot where moisture could sneak in. By lining those seams with fringe, folks basically built a rain visor. Water slid down the strips instead of slipping through the needle holes. The longer the fringe, the better it was at shielding the body. And when you were moving around, the fringe helped the garment dry faster too. With all those narrow strips fluttering in the breeze, moisture evaporated much quicker than it would from one big, solid piece of leather. During short breaks between storms, that extra drying speed could mean the difference between staying warm or getting chilled to the bone. The fringe did help break up a hunter's silhouette, sure, but when it came to rainy weather, its water-handling ability was its real superpower. Both the Iroquois and many Plains nations used fringe heavily, trimming everything from tunics to leggings to outer capes with it. Making good fringe took a careful hand. You couldn't just hack at the hide or you'd weaken the garment. Often, the fringe was cut from a separate hide and stitched into place along the seams, which meant damaged pieces could be swapped out without rebuilding the whole shirt. The leather needed to be soft enough to hang straight but tough enough to survive branches, brush, and constant use. And hey, give this a nod if you never realized fringe was more than decoration. Now, here's something that fascinated me. A building trick you might think belongs to modern roofing actually has its roots way back in the forests of North America. Up in the northeast woodlands, among the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, elm bark was the main material for making rainproof shelters. Elm bark had some incredible properties. When fresh, you could flex it like thick leather, and once it dried, it became strong, stiff, and impressively resistant to water. In springtime, when the sap rose, huge sheets of bark could be peeled off with surprising ease. Those big sheets were flattened under heavy weights until they turned into wide, smooth panels ready for building. Constructing a longhouse or even a quick field shelter looked a lot like laying roof shingles. Each sheet overlapped the next so that rain couldn't snake its way into the cracks. The upper pieces always covered the lower ones, making a layered cascade that guided water safely off the structure. The bark was tied to a wooden framework using bast fibers or spruce roots, which held strong and didn't rot after years of damp weather. Unlike animal hides, bark didn't stretch out, soak up water, or break down quickly. The roof ridge, the top line of the structure, got special attention, since that's the most exposed spot on any building. Extra bark sheets were laid there with a heavy overlap, sometimes shaped into natural gutters carved from bark itself. This kept rain out even when gusty winds tried to blow water upward and under the layers. Inside a finished longhouse, it stayed dry as a bone, even during storms that could tear through the forest. Elm bark wasn't smooth, either. Its rough, grooved surface acted like tiny channels, guiding rain down and away. Hunters built quick shelters using the same principle, though in a simpler way. They'd throw together a frame of branches, then stack whatever bark they could find in layered sheets. If elm wasn't around, birch bark worked beautifully. Birch bark is loaded with natural tar-like oils, so it shrugs off water and lasts without rotting. People stitched the sheets together with roots and sealed the seams with sticky resin taken from evergreen trees. A shelter like that could be built in an hour, and once finished, it kept someone dry through a full night of rain. And bark wasn't just for roofs. Native peoples crafted impressive canoes from it, too. Now, shifting back to the plains, the teepee wasn't just a simple tent. It was an incredibly efficient, aerodynamic design built to handle rain and wind better than most modern camping gear. The cone shape never let rain puddle or gather. Instead, it sent each drop sliding straight down the steep sides. The covering was sewn from smoked bison hides, which made it naturally water-resistant. But the real trick, the feature that kept the inside dry, was the pair of adjustable smoke flaps at the top, often called ears. Those smoke vents at the top of the teepee weren't just decorative flaps. They were smart, movable panels that you could adjust with long poles from the outside. By shifting them into the right position, you could close the smoke hole tight enough to keep rain from dripping in, while still letting the smoke from the hearth escape. The whole teepee was set up with the local winds in mind, too. Most families positioned the entrance facing east, toward the sunrise, which usually kept it pointed away from the wind-driven rain coming from the west. When those vents were angled correctly, they created a steady pull of air that funneled smoke upward even during a downpour. With straight, vertical rain, the flaps were drawn together to seal the top completely. When the storm blew sideways, the flaps were angled away from the wind, forming a little shield that blocked the slanting drops. Managing these vents was a skill, and the women of the tribe, who maintained the home, knew exactly how to read the weather and adjust everything just right. Inside the teepee, there was another protective layer that most folks today don't even know existed. It was a kind of inner wall about 5 feet high, made from hide or cloth. This lining was tied around the poles, forming a full ring within the space. It reached all the way down to the ground, while the outside cover purposely stopped a few inches short to allow ventilation. That gap between the two layers created a rising draft that carried smoke safely out through the top. But when the rain began, that liner took on an extra job. Any stray droplets sneaking in through lacing holes or sliding down the support poles hit the inside lining first. From there, the water simply ran down the outer surface of the liner and soaked harmlessly into the dirt, never reaching the sleeping area, blankets, or personal belongings. Because of that air channel between the two walls, the interior stayed warm and dry, even if the outer hide was drenched. Cold, wet air got trapped in the space between the layers, acting as a kind of natural insulation. The teepee's cone shape helped, too. Instead of catching wind like a flat wall, it guided the gusts down and around, pushing the structure into the ground rather than tipping it over. The poles themselves formed a flexible but amazingly strong frame that could bend a little under powerful winds without snapping. Rainwater slid down the sloping sides and soaked straight into the soil around the base. And if the weather looked especially bad, a simple trench dug around the teepee carried excess runoff away. Inside, life during a storm felt surprisingly cozy. The central fire warmed the space, and the heat bounced off the walls, spreading through the interior. Families sat on hides or blankets protected by 2 layers of leather and the constant airflow overhead. For a home that could be taken down and packed in minutes, a teepee was unbelievably sturdy and weatherproof. Every detail, every stitch, every pole had been perfected over centuries. There wasn't a single element that didn't serve a purpose. Now, let me tell you something that's a bit shocking but absolutely true. Wet feet could kill a person faster than hunger. When everything around you was soaked, keeping your feet dry wasn't just a comfort. It was a survival priority for any traveler or hunter. Different tribes used different styles of moccasins, but when the weather turned nasty, they had some clever tricks up their sleeves. Regular suede moccasins would get soaked in no time, so people treated them heavily with fat and smoked them until they were as water-resistant as possible. But the real magic wasn't in the shoe itself, it was in what went inside. They stuffed the moccasins with dry grass, moss, or bison wool. That soft filling created a cushion of air that insulated the feet from the cold, damp ground and kept the leather from sticking directly to the skin. And if the grass got wet, no problem, you just dumped it out and grabbed a fresh handful. Nature always provided more. This method worked way better than trying to dry the shoes themselves, which was nearly impossible when it kept raining all day. The dry stuffing soaked up both sweat and outside moisture, keeping the actual skin of the foot relatively dry. Out on the vast plains, Folks often wore moccasins with stiff rawhide soles, since rawhide didn't absorb water as much as soft suede. Rawhide did get slick on wet grass, though, so people sometimes scored the bottoms or left a bit of natural wool for better grip. Some tribes even used a kind of overshoe, galoshes made from untanned hide, for slogging through deep mud. Depending on how they were worn, the hair could face outward for traction or inward for warmth. If someone had to cross a soggy meadow or wade through a creek, it wasn't unusual for them to ditch the moccasins altogether and go barefoot, as long as the temperature wasn't too cold. Bare feet were easier to wipe off and warm than a pair of drenched shoes. To protect their moccasins, people tucked them under their clothing, close to the body, where the heat kept them dry until camp was made for the night. It took some toughness, sure, but saving those dry shoes was worth it. Once the fire was lit in the evening, caring for your feet was almost a ritual. No one ever put wet moccasins too close to the flames. That would shrink the leather into something hard as a board. Instead, the shoes were dried slowly, stuffed with warm ashes or stones wrapped in grass. When the leather softened again, they were kneaded by hand and finished with a little extra fat. Ignoring this routine could lead to trench foot, a brutal condition where the skin starts dying off from staying cold and wet too long. Native families understood just how dangerous wet feet could be, and they taught their kids early on to treat their shoes almost like sacred gear. A spare pair of moccasins was usually tied to the belt or tucked inside a dry pouch. That backup set wasn't just extra clothing, it was a strategic lifeline people guarded more carefully than most of their valuables. And honestly, if you were trekking through a drenched forest, could you bring yourself to walk barefoot just to spare your shoes? Folks back then absolutely could. They knew the trade-off meant survival. Out on the plains, bison hides were far more than trophies from the hunt. They were the original mobile homes, the all-season outerwear of an entire people. When a bison was taken in late fall or winter, its wool was thickest, and that hide became a prized buffalo robe. The magic of those robes came from the animal's dense undercoat and long guard hairs, the same natural armor that kept bison alive through blizzards and soaking storms. Bison wool has a built-in structure that naturally sheds water while trapping warm air close to the body. In a downpour, you'd wear the robe with the fur facing whichever direction made the most sense. If the rain was cold and biting, the wool side usually went inward to hold your heat in, while the smoked, oiled leather on the outside took the beating from the weather. That smooth leather acted as both a windbreaker and a shield against the rain. On the other hand, if the weather was dry but icy, you could flip the fur outward to soak up the sun's warmth. These robes were massive, too, big enough to wrap around yourself several times, turning your body into its own warm shelter. Many of them were decorated with painted geometric designs, and those paints had sticky, adhesive qualities that sealed the hide even more. A robe could grow pretty heavy when wet, but the protection it offered always made up for the weight. A person could sleep right on damp ground under one and still stay warm and healthy. Other animals offered useful skins too. Beaver and otter fur, for example, made lighter garments perfect for trimming collars, hats, or sleeves. Fur taken from water-loving animals had incredible water resistance thanks to natural oils that worked like waterproofing. Even a narrow strip of beaver fur around the collar could keep icy droplets from sliding down the back of your neck. Caring for these robes took time and skill. After a rain, the hide had to be dried slowly and worked by hand so it wouldn't stiffen. Women spent hours scraping, softening, and brain-tanning each piece, using bone tools and traditional mixtures passed down for generations. A good buffalo robe could last for many years and was often treasured enough to be handed down or given as a prestigious gift. Unlike the wool blankets brought by European traders, which turned heavy, cold, and soggy in wet weather, bison hides kept you warm even when soaked. It was a perfect example of using local resources to fit the local world. Now, building a fire in a heavy rain, that was a skill that separated seasoned survivors from folks who ended up in real trouble. The biggest obstacle was simply finding dry fuel in a forest where everything seemed drenched. Everyone knew wood lying flat on the ground was useless. It soaked up water like a sponge. Instead, they hunted for standing deadwood, old trees still upright, or the lower branches of spruce and fir that stayed shielded beneath the canopy. Even if the bark was wet, the heartwood inside generally remained dry. To get at it, they shaved or chopped off the soggy outer layer until they hit the dry core. From that inner wood, they carved thin curls called feather sticks or fire feathers, delicate shavings that caught a spark instantly. Birch bark made excellent kindling because its oily resins let it burn even when soaked, producing enough heat to dry out small sticks. Sticky conifer resin worked like a natural fire starter too. The way the fire was built mattered just as much as the materials. You never dug a pit because that just collected water. Instead, you built the fire up on a platform, a raised bed of stones or dry logs. When rain was still coming down hard, people often rigged a quick little canopy above the fire using a spare piece of bark or even their own cloak until the flames were strong enough to survive. Once a dependable bed of hot coals formed, the fire could shrug off falling raindrops. Travelers carried fire the same way we might carry a phone charger today. Instead of restarting a blaze every time, they kept a smoldering ember tucked in tinder or rotten wood, sealed inside a horn or clay pot. That ember could live all day, quietly glowing until someone breathed life back into it at the next camp. It saved time and spared them the struggle of making sparks in a storm, a nearly impossible task when everything was damp. And picking the right spot for a fire, that was just as important as all the tools and tricks. Whenever I needed to light a fire in the rain, I looked for anything that offered natural cover. An overhanging rock ledge, the thick branch of a big old tree, or even the corner of a makeshift shelter. Staying alive wasn't about building a giant bonfire. It was about keeping a small, hot flame going. One that didn't smoke too much but could still dry clothes and warm the bones. Big fires ate up too much wood and were almost impossible to protect from the weather, so the smaller, efficient ones were the real lifesavers. Inside a teepee, the fire never truly went out. That steady flame created a rising column of warm air that not only kept the family comfortable but also dried the very walls of the dwelling from within. And the smoke drifting upward formed a kind of invisible plug under the vent flaps, stopping rain from sneaking inside. The fire wasn't just a heat source. It was the beating heart of the home, the main defense against cold and dampness. Up in the forests and subarctic regions, native people turned to one of the most remarkable natural materials I've ever come across. Moss, especially sphagnum. This stuff can soak up moisture better than cotton and still hold its shape. Folks gathered it, dried it, and used it as an all-purpose, hygienic, absorbent tool. In a world where it felt like the rain never stopped, dry moss became a kind of miracle supply for protecting the most sensitive parts of the body and the most important pieces of gear. Babies rode in cradles lined with moss that acted just like diapers, soaking everything up in an instant and keeping their skin warm and dry. That mattered even more when the weather was bitter cold. Women also used moss for personal hygiene, and hunters carried bundles of it as quick-dry towels after trudging through storms. Inside moccasins, moss absorbed sweat and kept outside moisture from soaking the feet. Unlike plain grass, sphagnum had antiseptic qualities, stopping fungus and bacteria before they ever had a chance. The natural iodine and oils in the moss helped heal small cuts and scrapes, like carrying a forest-made first aid kit. People also packed moss into cracks in bark shelters or log joints to seal out wind and rain. It made a tremendous insulator, trapping warm air effectively. Sandwiched between two layers of hide or bark, moss created something like a primitive thermos. Collecting it was seasonal work. Women would gather big armfuls on dry days and hang it from branches until every last bit of moisture was gone. A well-stocked home always had a supply of dry moss tucked away. And if the moss did get wet, you could squeeze it out and dry it near the fire without much trouble. This simple plant saved countless people from infections, cold, and exposure. Where most modern hikers just see a soft, spongy patch under their boots, native people saw a powerful survival resource shaped by generations of knowledge and observation. But all these tools and tricks would have meant nothing without one last element: mental discipline. Native communities had an incredible ability to accept nature on its own terms. If the rain came down too hard and traveling became risky, they didn't go charging into danger. They stopped, pitched camp, built a safe shelter, and waited. Knowing when to pause and having the patience to do it was a survival skill every bit as important as making fire. During long stretches of bad weather, life didn't grind to a halt. People repaired tools, made arrows, stitched clothing, or shared stories. These slow, quiet hours built stronger communities and kept morale high. Panic and rushing around drain energy and lead to foolish mistakes, but calmness keeps you thinking clearly. They lived by the rhythms of the land. Rain wasn't seen as punishment, it was simply part of life, watering the earth and feeding the animals. That mindset made it easier to bear the cold, the wet, and the discomfort. If you couldn't change the storm, you changed your attitude toward it. Early explorers often wrote about the stoicism of native warriors. A man could sit beneath a hide cloak for hours without moving while the rain hammered down, almost like he was meditating. He knew that wrestling with the storm would sap his strength, while patience kept him alive. This resilience was taught from childhood. Kids learned not to complain about cold or dampness, but to look for solutions, no matter how small. In a group depending on shared survival, one person's whining could drag everyone down. So maintaining a steady, optimistic spirit was valued just as much as knowing how to shoot a bow. When you look at it all together, rain protection among the indigenous peoples of North America wasn't just a bunch of tricks, it was a whole science. Chemistry, physics, biology, architecture, psychology, all woven together through centuries of trial and error. From the fat rubbed onto the skin to the aerodynamics of the teepee, from the smoked leather to the insulating layers of moss, every piece fit into a larger system shaped by harsh weather and careful observation. They didn't try to conquer nature, they learned to work with it. And that knowledge, passed from one generation to the next, helped them thrive in some of the toughest climates on the continent. So here's my question to you. Which of these old survival methods do you think would actually help a modern traveler who finds themselves caught in the woods without any fancy gear? And which one surprised you the most? Let me know your thoughts. And stick around if you want to hear more of the old secrets that kept people alive long before we had waterproof jackets or synthetic fabrics.